Welcome to the Storypowers podcast, the show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is Shawn Callahan. Shawn is an award-winning author, business storytelling specialist, and host of the Anecdotally Speaking podcast. He's best known as the founder and director of Anecdote, one of the most experienced and highly regarded story-based management consulting firms in the world. In the storytelling world, some might be more famous, or richer, or even better looking than Shawn, but not many deserve to be called the Godfather of Business Storytelling. Ladies and gentlemen, Shawn Callahan. Shawn, welcome to the show.
That's a great introduction. Thanks, Francisco. I don't think I've ever been called the Godfather of Storytelling, so it makes me feel quite old when you say that. But no, I'll take it, though. I'll take it.
We were at this event together yesterday, and I realized that I was telling a story about my very first job in 1999, and then, going through your bio, 1999 was the year you started doing story work.
That's right. Yeah, I know. It's crazy, isn't it? And, when you think about just how those years creep up and how you get into this sort of work, because no one ever says, when you're starting university, I'm going to do story work. I'm going to help businesses with their storytelling. I mean, it doesn't seem to be a thing, does it?
I think you could argue that even today it's not a thing. It's one of those jobs or careers that a lot of people don't quite understand. I think if you say you're a professional speaker, a lot of people will get that, but story work is still, it will take a long time before that becomes more mainstream, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. And though, you've seen a lot of organizations, certainly when I started, it was very left field and people viewed it with quite a lot of suspicion. They thought we were sort of very left-wing tree huggers or something like that. And for some reason, we noticed that it was primarily women who engaged our services in those first probably 10 years. And then, it changed. And now, you're getting people all around the world, interested in doing work in this space. So, yeah, big changes. That's great.
Because you and Anecdote were clearly pioneers in this industry. So how much harder did it used to be compared to now? Or is it still as hard today as it was back then?
Oh, no. I mean, the great thing today is that you have lots of stories to tell about the impact of storytelling, right? Whereas in those early days, you were doing everything for the first time. I remember doing my first strategy story. Right. And I went into, it was called the Transport Accident Commission. And the CEO there, she had an executive that they weren't really on the same page in terms of their strategy. And so she sort of said, what can we do? And I said, maybe we can tell the story of the strategy and we'll take them through a process where they co-create that story. And she's going, this is great. I love it. Let's do it. And I'm thinking, oh my God, how do I do that? Like, what's the process? So I had to create it, right? So it's exciting. I mean, and that's the great thing about starting out. You get to do things for the first time. You feel like you're on the edge, and good things can happen.
I've got a question for you about the company name, because story is such a powerful word, and nowadays story and storytelling have become a bit of a buzzword, and some people are a bit zealot about what is a story, what isn't a story. And I've heard you say more than once about how many people think they're telling stories, but they're not, and if they're not actually telling a story, it doesn't work. With all that in mind, why did you name the company Anecdote?
Yeah, right. Well, when I started in storytelling, it wasn't actually storytelling that I was starting in. It was more like what I call story listening. I would go into organizations. I was working for IBM at the time. I would go into organizations and I would collect stories using a technique called Anecdote Circles. And it was kind of like focus groups, but instead of getting people's opinions, you're getting people's, experiences. And so we got really good at eking out stories in organizations and the techniques you needed to put in place to get people to actually tell you a story. And so the stories we heard were tiny little things, right? There were things like, someone would say, I went to my boss's office the other day and they were typing at their computer and they saw me out of the corner of their eye and they stopped and they sat down and we had this conversation and it really made a difference for me. And that was the end of their story, right? Like it was nothing like beautifully crafted stories that you hear out of Hollywood. There was no three-act structure. There was no, great turning points or denouements or hooks to get started. None of that was there, right? And it actually taught me that stories told in organizations are not like Hollywood stories. And I think this is one of the big mistakes a lot of storytelling people fall for, is that they do a search on Google and they go, storytelling, and the first one who pops up is Bob McKee, script writing, screenwriting for anyone, and they think that is storytelling that happens in organizations, but it's not. It's so far away from it that they sort of fall into a bit of a hole, I think, when they're in organizations. But so when I jumped out of IBM to start the company, I was actually very influenced by those small stories. And so I purposely wanted it to be called Anecdote because I remember I used to work for Oracle as well. So I had an IT background with, Oracle, Sybase, IBM, and they all had except for IBM, they had just one name. And I thought, I want a one name. And I remember also thinking that I wanted something that was at the beginning or the end of the alphabet, right? So Anecdote, that was good. I actually created a story bank called Czar Move under the same, sort of idea. And it just I wanted a word that, everyone used so that when they said anecdote, it had this double meaning for them. It was this anecdote, but there was also the company anecdote. So anyway, that's how we got started.
You mentioned small stories, and I've heard you say in the podcast, and that it jives with my experience, but for a completely different reason, about how small the stories can be. Now, because at the moment what I do with a lot of stories is I just put them on social media, and because attention spans on social media are what they are, it's usually on LinkedIn that I do that. I knew instinctively, okay, well, I think 2 minutes is the maximum. I don't think I'm going to get people to listen to a 4, 5, 6 minute story. So mine almost always end up being between 90 seconds and 2 minutes. And right. I've heard you talk to Mark Schenk in your podcast about how, is it 90 seconds to 3 minutes? You guys tend to think that it's sort of...
Yeah, that's around about that. But I'm starting to think they can be much smaller than that. I watched Brené Brown do her Netflix special. And I got one of my colleagues, Callum, to go through the whole 1 hour and identify all the stories and measure the length of those stories. Well, the majority of her stories are 60 seconds, right? And her shortest story is 7 seconds long. And her longest story is 6 minutes long, right? She tells, I think it's off the top of my head, in an hour, she tells 40 stories, right? So, these rules that we all, get tied up with, I'm not too sure if they're all that useful. A story can work if it's a good story. I remember Annette Simmons telling me, because I was sort of saying to her, what do you have? What do you do if the story is rubbish, right? How do you help the person? She says, well, go and get another story, right? So and I think it was a good lesson. It's not, you don't have to labor over making a story fantastic. If it's a rubbish story, you throw it away and you get a better story. Right? There's a lot of stories out there. So anyway, I did a blog post about that Brené Brown Netflix special, and I compared it with Kevin Hart, actually. So Kevin Hart does, of course, a comedian 1 hour special as well on Netflix, and he has almost like this same pattern of storytelling. It's uncanny. So yeah, check it out. 7 seconds, by the way, the 7 second story, if you're wondering what that sounds like, she walks on stage, right? And she says, and she's kind of laughing, and she says, I was walking on stage and they asked me, should I leave my handbag? No, I'm not going to leave my handbag. I'm a Texan, right? So it's a little tiny anecdote about this little sort of interaction she has with the person on the side of the stage, but allows her to introduce herself as a Texan. And also there's a little bit of moxie, a little bit of attitude that this woman has as she walks on stage. And it sets the scene. It sets the vibe for her whole presentation. So I love it. I think she's great. She's one of the great storytellers around at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, and she's the proof that being able to speak well is sometimes the difference between you becoming an industry or just being pretty much unknown, because I don't think there was vulnerability as something that got discussed in business circles until she did her TED Talk. And I've no idea how famous or not she was in academic circles, but she definitely wasn't mainstream famous. And now, if I'm not mistaken, she's the most sought after or well-paid speaker in the world. And if it's not she's in the top 5.
Yes.
Along people like Simon Sinek,
who's also a storyteller.
Yeah, and this is on the back of having done a couple, but particularly that first one, a very good talk, and it just shows the power of when you communicate effectively, that can still have a very large impact.
Yeah, I mean, she had a few things going for her because she had years of research to back up what she was saying. So she sort of got different levels at which she could speak, right? She could do a TEDx or a Netflix special, and she's talking to the masses. And so she tells stories about going swimming and, sort of the everyday sort of activities that the vast majority of people would have experienced. And that's how she connects. But she sort of says, well, but if you want to know more, well, here you can dive into my research and you can go and read a research paper, which I'm sure has very few stories in it. Well, it might, but, it's written a certain way. Academia has a certain approach. And so she can cascade down into that detail. If she didn't have that 20 years of research experience and publications, it'd be pretty hard for her to catapult from there to superstardom that she is, because I think she's creating a new category of entertainer, and it's sort of like a cross between a comedian and an academic, right? Sort of a comedidemic, let's call it that. And so I think she's creating a new class of, it was there, there's Gary Hamill, for example. He has that sort of feel about it. He's just one story after the next when you see him speak. So, yeah, it's definitely a pattern that we've seen out there. But, yeah, I think TEDx and TED Talks are helping it along the way.
Yeah, so I think that there's no real question now that TED, particularly the main TED platform, has been responsible for a resurgence of, not as public speaking never went away, but at least an understanding and appreciation that type of communication has a lot of power, and it's become an aspirational thing. A lot of people think, sort of kind of mistakenly, that if only they could do a TED Talk, or if they could do a TEDx talk, then all of a sudden their career is sorted. And that's definitely not the case. But I think it created this awareness that there is a lot of value in being a good speaker or being a good communicator. And that's perhaps not something that wasn't that clear to everyone before things like TED.
Yeah.
I wanted to pick you up on something. We were talking about the name Anecdote before, and I had a suspicion that the reason you had chosen that name was to avoid the loaded and misleading word story. I was talking to Paul Smith, who I know you're familiar with, a few episodes ago, and he told me that he wasn't even referring to the hero's journey or the Hollywood stuff, but he said when you ask people about stories, they tend to think of stories they always tell. Oh, I have that story about my sister. So something you always tell, not this thing that just happened. But if you ask, did anything interesting happen last week? They will have stuff to tell you. But if you say, have you got any stories from last week? They just wouldn't.
That's right. And people freak out a little bit when you ask them to tell a story because they think it's much bigger than what they imagine, right? They sort of go, oh my God, I need to craft this beautiful thing for you and entertain you and in some way. But in fact, yeah, what you're really asking is, have you had an interesting experience that would, sort of bring some light onto this topic that we're talking about? Yeah, no, I run into it all the time. I tell people, avoid the S word. You've just got to run a mile from it. There's so many other ways you can ask. You can sort of say, so what happened? Or, can you give me an example? Or what was the turning point? How did you feel when, take me through what actually occurred? There's a bazillion things you can say to get someone to tell you a story. But, there's a topic that I'd love to raise with you, right? Because I think we're teaching storytelling incorrectly around the world. And this affects all of us who've got this role of, coaching and helping people out. Because
fighting words, Shawn.
I know. I thought this is the perfect opportunity to talk about it, because I watched this amazing YouTube video, and I can't think of the guy's name, but he was a language professor from the US, right? And he said he was going to teach himself Arabic in 9 months, and he hadn't spoken a word of Arabic in his life. He was an English speaker, and Arabic is regarded as one of the hardest languages for an English speaker to learn, right? So the way he learnt it was he didn't do the grammar. How many times have you ever tried? Well, you have a couple of languages under your belt, right, Francisco? You just have to, from your part of the world. But, learning it by learning the grammar and the rules, and this comes after that, comes after this, how well does that work for people?
It doesn't. That's why children, the way you teach children is just by sheer exposure. And then the brain, this wonderful machine, picks apart what goes where and what works and what doesn't. And when you show them grammar, should be showing them something they already know how to do, and you're just explaining it.
Indeed, right. This is exactly my point. So you think about it, storytelling is a deeply language-based activity, right? And yet we're teaching people by sort of saying, well, you have to have this bit, then followed by that bit, and then you have the three, ascending levels of drama, and then you have the turning point, and then down the end. And you wonder why people are finding it hard to learn storytelling. If you want to teach storytelling, I think you don't teach it, you help people acquire it, right? And you do that exactly the way you're sort of mentioning with children, and that is you immerse them with stories. I'm always amazed that, when you hear people talking about storytelling and then they don't tell any stories. It's very hard for someone to learn storytelling unless they're hearing people actually tell stories, especially business stories, where you show them how to segue into that story and get out of that story in a way that, makes sense and has a point and all those sort of good things. I don't know. What do you think? This is just a new idea of mine. I've been excited by this idea because I'm not going to abandon completely, the teaching element, but I'm sort of really forcing now the acquisition element and balancing that out.
What I find is that most people naturally understand what the structure of a story is. I don't think compared to other types of speaking. So, for example, I'm involved with an MBA program here in Barcelona, and we just finished the course. So you have different types of speaking. You have the logos type of speech and the ethos, and the third module is storytelling. Now, the logos and the ethos, it's kind of you trying to put pieces together, right? Or this comes and then that part comes, and it's always a bit stilted in the beginning. Storytelling is where most of them come alive. They tell a story, sometimes just an amazing story, and there's often nothing you really need to change, but sometimes there is. And then what I found is that they don't know necessarily why the stories worked or didn't. So because we were doing this in circles, and you say, okay, what do you like about that? What could be better? And what I found was that they could talk about the effect that the story had on them,
yep,
but they couldn't pinpoint why it had worked or hadn't worked. So when I raised things, for example, like, is there a moment in that story? Is there something very specific that we're living through it? There's dialogue, there's all those vivid descriptions. And they go, no, I don't know, there wasn't. They just told us what happened. They didn't show us. And once you do that, they start, I think the senses get a little sharper, and then they start noticing things like that. Or, when we're talking about the message of the story, it's like, okay, was there a message? Yes, I think there was. Well, you think there was or there wasn't? And was the message supported by the story? I'm not so sure. So once you've done that, I think they start developing the critical facilities to say, okay, I have this story, but I'm not too sure about the moment. So I need some help getting into the moment. And these were 3-minute stories, which was very helpful because
Yeah.
the length helped. But I think that if you give people no guidance, they can keep doing it and doing it and doing it, and they won't necessarily know why it's working or why it isn't, and then it just becomes a bit harder to replicate, I think.
I do an activity in my workshop where at the right at the beginning, I just sort of say, okay, pair up, and I want you to describe to your partner what you do for a living. And they'll sort of say, well, I'm the CIO of the organization. I focus on the policies and procedures of ensure the technology is up and running and available. Anyway, they have to speak for a minute like that. And then once they've done that, I sort of say, okay, well, that's one way of communicating. But now I want you to just share a time with your colleague where you felt you made a bit of a difference at work. It doesn't have to be a big thing. Could be just, listening to a colleague, helping them out. And there's always a pause. They always go, oh, gee, I wonder what. And then they start saying things like, just 2 weeks ago, I went down to Janet's office and I walked in and I could tell she was upset. Anyway, they start telling this story, right, without hardly any prompting, right? And then I just say to them, okay, so what was the difference between those two? And they work it all out themselves. That you don't have to show one slide. You just they work out the fact that the visual element is important. They work out, like you say, moments give you visuals, and they work out there's emotion and how does that work. And I think in some ways, helping people go through the process themselves so that they start to feel what it's like to tell a story versus not tell a story, and realize that most of the time they're actually doing the former. That's how they speak in organizations, is one of the vital skills, the noticing. I think that's one of the vital skills. Yeah.
Yeah, there's an exercise I think I might have picked up from your book where I think you just mentioned something like, just for a day or two at work or with the people around you, just keep your ears open and try just you don't need to write it down, but pay attention to how many stories you actually hear. And it's incredible because if you speaking to your friends or you spend any time at work talking to people, most of what people do is give examples of things that have happened in their lives, did you just see what happened before we got here? No, and you start counting. But if you say to someone, "Oh, I really like that story you told today," they'll go, "What? I didn't tell any stories."
Yeah, I know, it's crazy. But the weird thing I find in organizations, and we must have trained ourselves to do this, is that in the informal spaces of work, we tell stories like crazy. But as soon as we walk into anything that's vaguely formal, all the stories disappear.
Well, but it's not just the stories, though, is it? It's the stories and the speaking like a human being also disappear.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. All of a sudden, they start talking like little robots and saying, well, there are 3 key things we need to focus on. And as a result of that, and therefore, and we get all authoritative, and unfortunately, it's totally forgettable for the people who are listening. They can't hang on to that information. So unless, of course, you pull out some spectacular, stat that, is mind-blowing in some ways. But other than that, it's hard to hang on to.
I noticed that with my students, I kept saying to them, I really like that, but can you now say it as a human being? And they would say, well, what do you mean? I says, well, you're dancing around the things you're trying to say, but you're not saying them. Right. So you're saying, okay, we need to align our priorities. Okay, and that means exactly what? Oh, we are doing too much of this and not enough of that. Okay, why don't you just say that?
Yeah.
Because if I don't know exactly where you're coming from, that sentence doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
So you need to dig a bit deeper and just get to the thing itself and stop talking about the category or the highfalutin concept behind what you're trying to say. And that leads me to something that I wanted your take on it, because obviously you have literally decades with experience with this stuff. So I like a lot the the personal story used for a business point. And I also was listening to some of the earlier episodes of your podcast, and there was a couple of examples I thought were excellent there. So one example was the bathroom story from Mark. Yeah, the one about the guy who, I don't know, redoing his bathroom was super hard, and then it was finally done. And the first thing he notices when he walks into the bathroom is that the grouting is not perfect. His wife drags him by the ear outside and says, "Let's do that again." And then he looks and says, "Oh, yes, it's a beautiful bathroom." And then the wife asks him, "Do you also do that at work?" Like, to just pick the negative first. And so that is an amazing story. And the other story I think you told the episode previous to that was the Alcoa story, about how Paul O'Neill focused on safety, and that turned the company around. And I think they were worth 5 times more than when he started from that. I think that most people in business will gravitate towards Alcoa type of stories, business context type of stories. But I think you and I can agree that the personal ones have a lot of power to them. So what has been your experience with threading the needle between teaching people they can actually use the smaller personal things and not just the case study type of stories?
Well, the personal story is so much easier, right? Because you've lived through it. And so to recount it requires no real thinking, except for here, this is the key point. You need to work out what the point of the story is. Not everyone can do that. I've discovered that's something that you have to put some effort in to get good at, hearing a story and going, oh, the point of that story is X. So whereas, stories like the Alcoa story, you got to learn that story, right? You got to read it. You got to get it into your head. You got to, I'm not much of the belief you should practice your stories. I know this sounds very antithetical, but I like practicing while getting real work done. That's my sort of theory. And that is, you find opportunities to tell that story in real life and real situations. But that requires effort, right, to do that. I heard a nice personal story in a business setting not too long ago. It was in a big bank, and the bank was actually, there was on a bit of a squeeze in terms of expenditure. So everyone's budgets were being cut. And the head of this one division, a woman, she walks in front of her, she's got a town hall, everyone's gathered together, pre-COVID, obviously. And she starts off by sort of saying, how my husband and I were doing the renovations at the moment, and there's all these nods, in the audience, and she says, "Oh, we got the quote in for the renovations." So my husband and I and my son, we all gathered around the kitchen table looking at it, and we realised we actually can't get it all done. Right? There's no way. We just don't have the money to spend to get that done. So we have to make some hard choices on what we're going to include and what we're not. Says we're facing something, right? Same sort of thing at the bank. I've been given the budget, and there's not as much there that we need to do all the things we want to do. So I need your help to work out what we're going to not do. How can we make the most out of this budget? And instead of everyone sort of going, boo, we're losing our money, they're all going, yeah, we'll help. How do we do this? It was just a absolute, masterstroke of influence and persuasion. And I don't think she wasn't doing it in any sort of manipulative way. It was just her natural way of explaining things. And she just likes to use stories as analogies. And I think that's where the personal story can work really well. If you're good at sort of going, oh, that thing that happened with my husband, in the budget, that's a bit like what's happening at work with the budget. And if you can make that little connection, that's a fantastic story. What people don't like, I don't think, is the ones where it's hard to make a strong connection with the personal story to the business point, right? If you can't make a strong connection, they feel a bit uncomfortable about that, I think.
I guess that's where something that you talk about in your book comes in, the relevant statement. When you're teaching people storytelling, one of the things that we don't want them to do is say, oh, I have a story about that. Normally, you want people to just launch into the story and not have a whole bunch of preemptive things, because they usually use the wrong preemptive things. But Can you just explain what the relevant statement is?
Yeah, it's simply putting the point of the story before you tell the story, right? Which doesn't seem logical. You think you're giving away the story by doing that, but you typically have some emphatic point of view, right? You might start off by just sort of saying, look, in my experience, small things make a big difference. I was doing some work at a pharmaceutical business 3 years ago, and you start into the story. And by doing that little 1-2 step, the audience is going, okay, I'm going to learn about how small things can make a difference. And so they're listening to your story with that in mind. And when it happens, it's like, the penny drops for them. And they go, got it, yes. That is a good example of how small things make a big difference. And they love it. And then the ending of the story, you got to be careful not to say too much at the end of the story. I'm a big believer, actually, of not saying anything. Finish the story and then let them say something. Right? That's great. But if you are going to say something, you might sort of say, yeah, look, it's an example of how small things can make a difference. But you don't explain the story.
Yeah, I guess that you can have a connection. You can have a bridge between, I'm not telling stories and I'm going to start telling a story that is lighter than the relevant statement. So you can say, what we're going through now reminds me of something that happened last year. I was working at a pharmaceutical company, but then I guess that you end up having to give the business point at the end, not to risk them getting the wrong message from your story. But I think it's always that balance between not turning what is commonly called in the industry a pull strategy, which is a story which sort of pulls people along and lets them figure out by themselves what the message is, into a push strategy. Because if you're outlining in all the words, this is exactly the moral of the story, then perhaps the story doesn't make that point well enough.
Correct. And, I think if you can get into that habit of putting the point before the story, the relevant statement, it has another great benefit, and that is it keeps you on track. You must have heard people tell stories where they start off by sort of saying, yeah, so just yesterday I went down to the supermarket and I bumped into my brother there. And you know how my brother is in the wine industry? Well, he was telling me about this Shiraz. Actually, I've got this great Shiraz that I had last night, and it was, it's just like these, tributaries off a river, one after the next. If you know what your point is, you just drive to the point and doesn't drive your audience crazy.
That's another thing I've noticed when, a lot of times I talk to people and, we talk about everybody's a storyteller and all of that. Yes, but we clearly have lost the skill with it. We don't. It's not part of our culture anymore, at least in most of the Western world. So some people are horrible storytellers, and I have plenty of friends where they start telling you a story, and 10 minutes in, you still have no idea what the story is about.
Right.
So
yeah,
I think I've seen. I think it was Matthew Dix, who is one of the guys who does a lot of storytelling at the Moth. I think he's won the Moth Grand Slam like 45 times. So he's probably arguably the best storyteller in the world, if that's how we're judging it. And I think he said something like, a story is 5 seconds. The story is the moment of change in the story, the moment of transformation, the moment of the aha. That's what the story is. And the bathroom story is, that moment when the wife highlights to him that he's doing at work, or asks him if he's doing at work the same thing he just did at the bathroom. And says that's what the story is about. Everything else is just context. And that's what I think a lot of people don't get is, what is the moment your story revolves around? Give me enough context to understand it and what happened after, and then you're done.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a rhetorical device, him saying that, because, of course, if he, it's just one of those definitional things. It's but it's an interesting idea. You do need to know what that key moment, that insight. Gary Klein is a really interesting psychologist in the US, and he said that insight is when you unexpectedly come to a better story. And I think this is it actually feeds into that data storytelling conversation we were having the other day at the conference, right? And it's the same sort of thing for those data analysts. They got to work out what's the insight that they're wanting to convey, and then they got to work out the story that goes around it to deliver that insight. So very similar sort of idea.
I'm speaking to Connor Neo tomorrow. He's someone I've known for years and is sort of big speaker on the leadership arena. And there's this thing he developed with another friend of mine, and he calls Point X for any speech, which is at the end of my speech, I want my audience to.
Right.
I want them to do something. I want them to feel something. I want them to know something. And if I've seen the Chris Anderson from TED say that if you cannot write the message of your speech or your talk in 15 words, you don't know what it is.
Right.
And then you shouldn't do it. And it's kind of the same, the relevant statement or the point of your story. If you don't know what that is and you can succinctly describe it, then you haven't figured out what your story is about. Something interesting happening, there's something in there, but you're not quite there yet with figuring out when you would tell it and why you would tell it.
Right, exactly. And, that's what you need to know in a business context when you're using story as a as in a purpose, for a purpose, right? To get something done, to inspire some action or whatever it might be. Of course, it's not the case when you're catching up with friends for a coffee, right? You've got a totally different environment there. Mind you, if you went down to a cafe and you sat down and you spoke to them like you did in your organization, they would think you're crazy. If you sat there and going, well, there are, 4 things I want to cover today in my conversation, they just look at you like, you've just gone over the edge. But you're right. And I think working out, that real meaning sometimes happens through telling the story. And this is what comedians do. They think they've got a bit, and they try it out on stage and they try it again and they give a different perspective. And then they go, oh, it's that bit. That's the meaning of the story, right? So this is where the meaning comes and emerges from the telling, as opposed to, oh, I've got this point and I'm going to try to make it with the story. In fact, my experience, it's more like the comedian, helping the meaning emerge from the story. It's very hard to go the other way. Like I used to try to tell in the very beginning of my career, I thought, the way you teach storytelling is you help people decide what point they're going to make, and then you find a story to make that point. Well, I discovered it's almost impossible to do, right? It's actually better to just build a repertoire of stories and then trying to work out what those stories mean, so that when you're faced with having to make that point, you've already got a story. So it requires you to have you have pockets full of stories. And, that's what our podcast is all about, is just trying to help people, build that repertoire of stories so they have lots of stories to tell.
Yeah, I guess the challenge with that approach, which I also like, I think storytelling shouldn't just be something. I've heard people say that all you really need are a few core stories. And, if your business is not telling stories, then having 3 core stories might be all you need for every sales meeting you ever had or whatever. And I can see the logic in that approach. And I think that's a lot easier to sell to people, that approach, than the approach of actually you need dozens and dozens of stories. But I think there's also the barrier to entry. So if you say to someone, okay, well, you can become a better communicator or salesperson or whatever, we just need to find something in your real experience that illustrates whatever you're trying to get across to your clients or your prospects much better with a story than all this nonsense you're saying to them. You can convince people of that. But if I say to them, listen, let's just start getting the stories together. Once we have a few dozen, we'll find one that is relevant to every moment. I think that a lot of people balk at that, that approach.
It's a long-term approach, isn't it? It's one where you're putting a lot of effort into the process of storytelling, as opposed to the next story that you're going to tell. I expect you to do both.
I wanted to pick up on something you said before about being against practicing stories as such, rehearsing them.
Yes.
And one of the reason I want to talk about that is because one of the things that from your work has influenced me a lot is that storytelling is a strange business, because I think it's almost more easier to find these days someone that talks about story but doesn't actually tell stories and uses the elements of story for a whole bunch of things. And one good example is your friend Park Howell from the
Yes.
Business of Story,
Mm,
who I should be having on in a couple of weeks.
very good.
And Park, although he's clearly a good storyteller and his book is full of stories, most of his approach is a branding approach. It's using the elements of story to brand the company, and story brand is a similar approach. And your approach is very much oral stories and mostly small oral stories. So I wanted to ask you about one, how come you realized that was 100% the way to go with story? And also this thing I've seen you talk about, what happens with when oral stories meet written language and the confusion that ensues.
Yeah. Well, let's take the first one. I mean, I guess just that experience I had in the early days of collecting stories in organizations, the oral stories that people tell, it sort of made it very clear that if you wanted to communicate without sounding weird or sounding like you're trying to pull the wool over people's eyes, you had to speak the same way that people spoke in organizations, right? And that's through small oral stories. I think good storytelling is invisible, right? As soon as you see anyone starting to use the storytelling voice, or as we said before, sort of use the S word, or just making it obvious. Now, there are exceptions to this, right? I saw a guy just the other day, PhD student, give a 3-minute presentation of his PhD results using the 3 little pigs as his structure. And I usually hate that sort of thing, right? I can't stand fables and things like that in business. I'm not very interested in it. But I have to admit, I was very drawn into that, and it was a good use of storytelling. But yeah, so I think that was my belief. There's a researcher in the US called David Bogie, and it's very hard to get into. He writes in a particular way that is difficult, but inside his writing is this. I did a lot of work in Disney in the 1980s around collecting stories. And it was that really introduced me to this idea of the tiny micro narratives that you need to have. And I guess that's where I started thinking that if you want to change a culture, you have to change the stories that are being told, right? The biggest project we've done in this space was actually for the biggest bank here in Australia, where they were told that their frontline staff could no longer get commissions for the products they sold. The commissions were causing all sorts of terrible behaviour, right? But they were worried that if they took away the commissions, their revenues were going to drop. We convinced them that they needed to move away from explicit rewards to implicit rewards, right? And the way we do that is to actually get them telling stories about the impact they have on their customers. So we ended up teaching 1,400 branch managers how to find and tell stories. And in their branch, sometimes it's once a week, sometimes it's multiple times a week, they huddle together at the end of their shift, and someone just shares a story about something that happened with a customer. And then they have a conversation about it. They sort of ask questions like, so why is that significant? Or and what would happen is that they would work out just through the conversation what good customer service was, right? But it had these other uncanny benefits, right? And one of the uncanny benefits is that the language they used to describe their customers changed. So in the past, the way they would talk about a customer was like a transaction. They would say, we had a customer in the other day. They were organising a mortgage, and I sold them mortgage insurance. And they'd all high-five each other like, they just won the big lottery. Now, the way they talk about it, they'd say something like, did you see David Smith came in, the wheat farmer that's just 30 kilometres out of town. He was in the other day trying to get some funding for a thrasher. His thrasher sort of fell over, wasn't working. And anyway, we organised that for him. I saw him the other day. He told me they got a bumper crop in, and he says it's unbelievable just how good the conditions are out there at the moment. So this is how they're talking about their customers now. Whereas before they didn't even think about what they were doing outside the branch or anything like that. And here's the kicker, their revenues didn't drop. their revenues actually started to rise and their engagement scores, employee engagement scores, jumped up, right? Now, that's all little stories, right? That's not beautifully told. No one's actually been told to use different sort of structures or anything like that. They're just told, share an example of where you've made an impact on a customer.
This reminds me of a definition I've heard you and Mark use in the podcast, and it believes in the book as well. I think you said that a story is data wrapped in context and delivered with meaning. I think Mark said facts wrapped in context and delivered with meaning. And in that example you give, I mean, I can clearly see, and this is the sort of thing I have used with companies, is this idea that you are doing a job that you don't care about. You're doing a job that you don't care about, you don't buy into, maybe you're selling insurance. There's nothing particularly inspiring about selling insurance. Actually, there's plenty that's inspiring about selling insurance, but you need the actual context of your customers. You need them to be people that you've helped. And if you give that context and that meaning, essentially, if you have the story of your customers, then it's not, oh yeah, I sold them this investment, I sold them this insurance. But I think because of corporate speak or because of whatever reason that I don't know, we have divorced a lot of our jobs from the person that gets helped on the other end of the business. And then, why would you care about selling insurance to someone if there's no commission to it?
Yeah, that's right. They make the mistake that people go to work just with the idea of making money, whereas people go to work because they want meaning, they want purpose. And, Adam Grant has done some great research on, the productivity improvement you get if you remind them of the purpose through stories of what they're doing. It's like phenomenal differences in terms of people being reminded of the money that they've been earned versus the impact that they can have on people's lives. We're a social species. We want to help people. We want to have empathy.
Is there any way to talk about purpose without stories? Because then you just end up with, even if it's a well-written purpose statement or a mission statement, I mean, is there such a thing? Is this an oxymoron, a well-written mission statement?
Well, I actually did see one just recently. So most of them are terrible, I have to say. I'd say 95%, more than that, 99% are terrible. But I did see one, and it was Elon Musk actually, just talking about the purpose of Tesla. And it was a little bit I guess it was unexpected. See, I thought Tesla was about building cars, right? That's not the purpose of Tesla. The purpose of Tesla is to make sustainable energy available to the world. So he's just using cars as the mechanism to get great battery and other technologies, to more people in the world. So he's on a sustainability mission. So I saw that little purpose statement. I thought, geez, yeah, I could get behind that. That'd be cool to work for a company like that. Whereas, the majority of purpose statements I see are just awful.
Yeah, the only shame about Tesla is that, yes, I fully buy into the company's mission, but I know from first-hand accounts that working for him, not necessarily the
well, yes, if you work for any of those A-type personalities, it's going to be a nightmare, isn't it? Yeah, he doesn't. Well, yeah, I read his biography or a biography of Elon Musk, and yeah, he seems like a difficult person. That's for sure.
It's the irony of a lot of these purpose-driven companies that seem to pop up in every single TED Talk or keynote, Apple being another perfect example where it's all amazing unless you have to interact with the genius that is running them. Right, Shawn, I'm mindful of your time now, so I just wanted to. I'm gonna say here that, as I said before, I think your book is amazing. I've recommended it to a lot of people. It's called Putting Stories to Work. Your podcast is very good fun as well, and it's called Anecdotally Speaking, and it's very short. Right? I think most episodes are only 15 minutes long, right?
Yeah, 15 minutes. Yep.
And it's you and Mark exchanging stories and how you would use them, why they work, why they don't work. So what I wanted to ask you is, if someone is not familiar with your work and for whatever reason doesn't want to buy the book or listen to the podcast, where should they go?
Just go to our website, anecdote.com. I mean, we've been going since 2004, and the first thing we did was start a blog. I blogged like crazy. A bit embarrassing, actually, if you go back to the original blog posts. But there is a heap of content there, all free. Just download and immerse yourself into the world of story.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for your time. We saw each other 2 days running. Now I probably won't see you for a very long time, but it's been an absolute pleasure, Shawn.
Thank you very much. It's been fantastic.
All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves, and until next time. I hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, I'd love for you to subscribe and leave us a review or a rating on the Apple Podcasts app. It's very easy. You open the app and find this show. Then scroll down a little, and when you see the stars, tap. I'd really appreciate it, and it does help other people find us. And if you'd like to get in touch or find out more about what I do, reach out to me on LinkedIn or visit my website, storypowers.com.